I promise I won't go for that. Thank you, Zoom. And yeah, and I promise that I won't go that long this time. So as Alison said, I've got about a 40-minute presentation here, and 20 minutes for questions. And really, the most important thing, though, is really, I could talk all day about research ethics, and we'd only really begin to scratch the surface. More importantly is that you're aware of two things, I would say. One, that there are resources at the University of Saskatchewan to help you with your ethics applications. Those are, especially if you're a graduate student, your primary resource should always be your academic supervisor. But secondary, there's myself and my colleague, Joni. And so we are here to help you. We answer questions, respond to emails, discuss over the phone. Time permitting, we'll also do preliminary reviews of ethics applications. So I think most importantly, when you go away today, I want you to know that I'm here to help and that contacting me is not a burden on me. It is a core function of my job. So a lot of people are like, oh, am I imposing? It's like, no, you're keeping me employed. So I'm quite grateful for any questions and happy to discuss. But also second, that ethics can be a daunting process. In many ways, it's hard. It's hard to fill out these forms, and it can feel a little bit intimidating to think, I'm going to get a 10-page notice of ethical review. But the REB is really here to help. It's here to facilitate research, and it's here to provide sort of what it hopes to be is helpful feedback. It doesn't always do that, but so try not to approach it from a point of fear. Try to approach it as you're working with a collaborator to help sort of tighten the ethical aspect of your research project. The REB almost never says no. In my entire time in research ethics, which is, I would say conservatively, I've seen probably 5,000–6,000 applications go from submission to approval. I've only seen 2 at the University of Auckland and 2 at the University of Saskatchewan that basically the REB said, no, you cannot do this project. So in all likelihood, the REB is not going to say no. The REB is going to say, okay, there's some gaps in the information, there's some inconsistency, there's just some things we can do to improve the ethical aspect of this project. And so finally, before I begin my sharing my screen and begin my presentation, I just want to apologize. I have no less than 4 small children running around the house today, so I may have to quickly mute myself just for the sake of your own eardrums. I have requested that they try to be quiet. I fully expect that they will become crashing around at any given moment. So my apologies if I do get interrupted. Okay, so now let me make sure that I share the right screen. I'm doing this in the wrong order. My apologies. I always get this wrong. There we go. Share that one. Okay, perfect. Now, please let me know if I'm sharing the wrong screen, but I think that should be right. Great. Okay, so what am I talking about today? I'm going to talk very briefly about research ethics historically, and then what you need to do, what kinds of projects require ethics approval, and then talk about the application, not so much the process, but the content of the ethics application, and applying the TCPS2 to your ethics application. So briefly, when we talk about research ethics historically, we tend to go all the way back to World War II and the revelations of sort of Nazi doctors experimenting on prisoners of war and prisoners within concentration camps. I'm not going to go through the whole timeline. We'd be here all day. But really, I want to sort of highlight what the most common types of harms are. And it really usually is around a lack of consent or a lack of informed consent, a lack of voluntary consent. That is, people, it used to be, at least when research was done unethically, people were involved without their permission or without their knowledge of what they were involved in. And that tends to be one of the most common aspects of it. But certainly in Canada, we can change that to be not just that individuals were not involved with their permission, but indeed entire communities were not involved in research projects without their permission. That is, without permission by the community for how the research was going to be conducted, and to ensure that the community was involved in all aspects of it. And that's going to be important later on when we talk about community engagement in research. So just keep these in mind that, you know, in a lot of ways, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today and a lot of the requirements in ethics application are really have come about due to sort of these historical incidences in which, you know, individuals and communities were basically involved in research without their permission. Now, what requires REB approval? The TCPS2, which I'll be talking about in a minute, really sets a very broad sort of definition of research requiring REB approval. And it really just says that research that involves living human participants or research that involves the biological materials such as human embryos, fetuses, fetal tissue, reproductive materials, and stem cells, whether derived from living or deceased individuals, all of that requires REB approval. Some types of projects are exempt, and articles in the TCPS2, articles 2.1 to 2.6 discuss the most common types of exemptions. And these are typically projects that either pose literally no risk to the participants or use research methods, but are in fact not actually considered research under the definition of research in the TCPS2. The main thing to take away from this is, though, that these definitions can be actually fairly tricky. So much so that even the REB, which, you know, looks at these all the time, can sometimes be a little bit stumped whether or not a project is exempt. If you think your project requires REB approval, it probably does. And so we recommend that you reach out to us, and we can provide a formal determination of whether the project requires an application or is exempt. And this doesn't require the completion of a full application. Rather, just a simple couple of paragraph description of the project via email. We can then get a vice chair to review that pretty quickly, 2 to 3 weeks, and then provide a formal letter of exemption or a formal request for an application. A lot of times, sort of why we do this is not unfrequently, researchers will go ahead with research that they assume to be exempt, and then they get to the publication phase, and the publisher's like, well, it appears you'd be working with human participants or human data, you know, have you talked to your REB? And then they come to us and say, can we get approval or an exemption? And the REB will not perform a retrospective review, even for the determination of exemption. So the REB just say, sorry, we can't. And so the researcher's stuck because now they've collected their data, and they want to publish, and the publisher won't let them. So always talk to us early and before you begin any aspect of your research, if you think it is. And that way we can provide you with a formal determination. Now, when it comes time to begin filling in your ethics application, or even thinking about your project, the guiding document in Canada for research involving human participants is the TCPS2, which is the Tri-Council Policy Statement on the Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Human Participants. And this is issued by the 3 big federal government funders for research, NSERC, CIHR, and SSHRC. Covering sort of all the main types of research that universities are likely to conduct. Yeah, and so if you want to understand how the REB is going to approach your application, the TCPS2 should be the first document that you consult. It's available in a variety of media. You can ask for a paper copy. You can also download a PDF. I always recommend access it as an HTML document, and it's really easy to find. You can just Google search TCPS2, take you right to the website. The reasons why I recommend that researchers use the HTML version is because the document itself it's a living document, and it is changed on a regular basis, oftentimes without a formal notification. And so you don't want to be using an obsolete document. The HTML document is guaranteed to be up to date. I also recommend that read through all of the chapters that are relevant to your project from beginning to end, because it is a really useful reference document. But its use as a reference document increases exponentially if you're aware of what's already there. Not all chapters in the TCPS2 will be relevant to your project. The whole document is about 220 pages. And there's going to be chapters that are unlikely to be pertinent to your purposes. So, for instance, there's a chapter on how to run an REB. There's also a chapter on clinical trials, which are unlikely to be relevant to most applicants. So identify the chapters that are important for you, read them from beginning to end, and then that way you can go back and you can refer to it as needed. But really it is to understand how the REB approaches the an application when it comes to review it. All aspects of the TCPS2 are important, but the core principles are even a little bit more important. And so the TCPS2 sets down 3 principles for the conduct of research involving human participants. These 3 principles are respect for persons, concern for the welfare of the participants, and justice. And they can really be broken down to the idea that free and informed consent, that is when, and a respect for the participants' autonomy, so that you are not forcing or tricking people to participate. Rather, they are coming to you out of a genuine interest and curiosity about participating in the project. That any risks, potential risks associated with participation are managed in such a way as to minimize the likelihood that participants may be negatively affected as a result of participating. And finally, justice is the idea that research should be more inclusive, but also should create safe spaces for people who are invited to participate. And justice really comes down to the idea that historically research was done sort of by sort of white European men for their benefit, for the benefit of white European men. So they enjoyed all the benefits, but they imposed all the risks on minority and vulnerable populations. And so really, it's about trying to right that, that historic wrong to ensure that research is being done to help everybody, but also that all the risks associated with the research are shared as broadly as possible. Now, how do we apply these principles when it comes to the application process at the University of Saskatchewan? That is, how do you apply them when it comes time to sit down and write out your application? First thing to note, there are a number of regulatory requirements associated with the conduct of research at the University of Saskatchewan, including research that involves human participants. For student projects, the principal investigator needs to be an academic supervisor. A graduate student, whether a master's or a PhD, cannot be the principal investigator for a project as nominated in an ethics application. In addition, all students who are involved in research projects, whether it be for a master's or for a thesis or even as research assistants, must have completed the TCPS2 online tutorial course on research ethics. And this is a modular course put out by PRE, which is the government agency that oversees the TCPS2. It is free, readily accessible, and it is required, students are required to have completed it. If you completed, I believe it's called GPS 961, you will have completed this module. So when it comes time to complete your ethics application, the most important sections when you are completing it are the privacy and confidentiality section, recruitment, consent, and engagement. And in my experience, it is these sections where strong applications are well done and weaker applications tend to struggle because the information maybe is insufficient or inconsistent. I'm going to go very briefly through these, just doing a quick time check. Important things to consider when you are discussing the privacy and confidentiality of your participants. First of all is when we discuss privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, in everyday conversations, we tend to use these terms interchangeably and relying on context to sort of provide the information about specifically what we're talking about, and that's fine. But within an ethics application, these terms actually have very specific meanings, almost technical meanings. And it's really important that you use them well in your ethics application, and you use them precisely, because otherwise you're sort of creating the impression in your reviewer that maybe you're not quite as well versed in ethics as you need to be, and suddenly they're going to start giving you a really thorough review. Speaking for myself as a reviewer, the hardest applications to review are the ones that are really well done, because it creates an assurance in you, the reviewer, that that the researcher knows what they're doing, and your mind kind of wanders because you're like, I get it, yeah, you're fine, right? The easiest applications to review are the applications that are a little bit rockier, maybe using imprecise terminology, and maybe not addressing questions in the way that the REB would like. And suddenly your antenna go up and you start poring over every last word, and you get really thorough in your review. The TCPS2 does have a glossary at the end of it that provides really helpful definitions for terms, all terms associated with research involving human participants, but it provides great definitions for things like privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity. And I'll sort of touch on those now. So when we talk about privacy, what we're talking about is that an individual should have control over private information. That is, they have control over when it is shared, with whom it is shared, and how it is shared. And really, when you are negotiating the participants' involvement in a project, you're really negotiating around privacy, in which you're saying to the participant, this is my research project, this is my research question, this is the information I need from you, this is how I will collect it, and this is how I will then analyze it and share it. And they say, okay, I'm comfortable with that, so I consent to be involved. Or they may say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with that, so I prefer not to be involved. Now, when we talk about confidentiality, what we mean is that confidentiality is an agreement between the participant and the researcher for the participant to share private information, and for the researcher to maintain the confidentiality as agreed upon in the consent process, which the researcher basically says, I'm not going to tell anyone that you participated, but I will share your information in this way, and that maybe I'm going to aggregate the information and perform a thematic analysis, and then share my thematic analysis via a dissertation or a journal article. So confidentiality is really just an agreement for the handling of one's information. Anonymity is where nobody knows whether or not an individual participated, including you, the researcher, and that it is impossible to connect that information back to a participant. Most commonly, research participation and research data are anonymous when participants take part in an anonymous online questionnaire. So there are no identifiers in the data itself, such as names, social insurance numbers, health card numbers, and things like that. And you, the researcher, have no idea whether or not someone participated. It's not uncommon in ethics applications for researchers to refer to confidential data as anonymous, or to refer to the data as both confidential and anonymous. Confidentiality and anonymity are mutually exclusive. In the TCPS2, it is either confidential or it is anonymous. It can't be both. Now, when we talk about recruitment, what we're talking about is how are you going to identify your potential participants, and then how are you going to invite them to participate? Most projects will use a passive form of a recruitment. That is, they will put up posters or social media announcements, and then people will respond to those by contacting the researcher. So they'll say, hey, I'm eligible, that sounds interesting, I'd like to participate, and they call you up or they send you an email. Unfortunately, in ethics applications at the University of Saskatchewan, and really everywhere, I imagine, recruitment tends to be underexplained. And this is really due to the prevalence of the passive voice in ethics applications. So many applications say an email will be sent to the participants. But what the REB really needs to understand the recruitment process are details and context. Who's going to send the email? When are they going to send it? Where, how are they going to do it? You know, these things matter. So I always recommend when you are drafting your recruitment process, use the active voice. The student researcher will send an email to the prospective participants, or you know, the principal investigator will post the social media advertisement to their Facebook account and things like that. So that gives you, the reviewer, a good sense of who's doing what, because what the reviewer is trying to understand is whether or not the recruitment process could accidentally, inadvertently create coercion. And this usually comes about where there is a pre-existing relationship between the participants and the researchers, which happens not infrequently. And so where there is a pre-existing relationship, the REB wants to understand what the nature of that relationship is, and whether or not it's characterized by a power imbalance that might affect the participant's decision to participate. So if the participant, or if the potential participant, is dependent upon the researcher for services or employment or care, how is that going to affect their decision whether or not to participate? And the example I usually use here is sort of exaggerated to sort of demonstrate the purpose. Is, you know, a principal calls a teacher into their office and they say, you know, I'd like for you, you know, I'm doing a master's of education. I'd like for you to participate in my research project. By the way, your salary evaluation is tomorrow. You know, how is the teacher able to make a decision that is truly autonomous, right? They're going to feel obliged to participate because, you know, maybe they just got a big new mortgage and they need a raise. So always help the REB understand whether or not there are pre-existing relationships and whether or not they're characterized by imbalance. It's not unethical to have a pre-existing relationship with your potential participants, so long as the recruitment is structured in such a way as to maximize their autonomy, that is, their ability to make a free and informed decision. Now, the TCPS2 requires that consent be free, that is voluntary, informed, ongoing, and prior to the data collection. So you can't collect consent after the fact. It has to be before the data is collected from your participants. It must be voluntary, but it also must be informed. And this is really when we talk about the consent process, this is probably the most important aspect of the consent process. Ensuring that your potential participants, when they are considering whether or not they want to participate, are making an informed decision, so that you apprise them of what their involvement looks like, and what their obligations as a participant will be. And it's really important to share this information in a way that is meaningful to them. Too many consent forms, as submitted, are written without a consideration of their audience. I'll talk about that in a bit. But really, you know, ask yourself, if I were to be explaining this process to, you know, someone who is not a university graduate student or lecturer, how would I phrase it? How would I frame it? How would I describe it? And equally important is that consent needs to be ongoing. That is, consent, the participants should be able to withdraw consent at any time. So that if, you know, 5 minutes before the interview, halfway through the interview, or even immediately afterwards, they can say, actually, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this, or not even give a reason. They can just say, you know what, I don't want to participate, you know, and they can either not be involved in the research or even withdraw their data, and even after the fact, because they may have a change of heart, you know, a week or two afterwards. So it's important that you set this out in the consent process so the participants are aware that they can withdraw their consent at any time. And the final important section is community engagement. And really, when we talk about community engagement in the Canadian context, we're really talking about Indigenous community engagement. And this is important enough that it has an entire chapter dedicated to it in the TCPS2, and it is one of the biggest chapters in the TCPS2. How do you engage with communities, specifically Indigenous communities in Canada, to ensure that past sort of unethical research involving Indigenous communities, the past mistakes are not repeated? I always think of Indigenous engagement as nothing about us without us. That is, the community is invited to be a collaborator in the project to an extent that they are comfortable or willing. And this really comes down to consultation. And so that researchers who are going to be working with communities, with Indigenous communities, have a pre-existing relationship with those communities that is based on mutual respect and reciprocity, and that they discuss with those communities, in which the community says, ideally, we have a question about ourselves that we would like to answer. We think you have the skills and the knowledge to help us answer that question. And that the community or representatives of the community are involved in basically developing the research question, identifying the research methodologies and the methods for data collection, and that they're involved throughout. So they're involved in the recruitment, they're involved in the collection of the data, they're involved in the analysis of the data, and they're involved in finding ways that are appropriate and accessible to disseminate the findings. Too many researchers will say, you know, the REB will ask them, well, wait a minute, how are you going to share your findings with the community? And the researchers will say, I'll make a copy of my thesis available to them. I've written 2 theses now, and I can say hand on heart, no one, not even my mother, has read them. You want to make sure that the knowledge translation, the knowledge dissemination it takes into account the context, that it takes into account the community, and so that it is appropriate to the community. One of the great instances or the great illustrations of this that I've seen is the researchers, in their application, they said the community, we've been informed by our community partners that the community receives most of its information through the radio. And so they were going to create, as part of their knowledge translation, 30-second little sort of information blurbs about the research findings, and then put them on the radio for the community to receive. So stuff like that, to be, the REB really appreciates it, where there's a real demonstration of a knowledge and a collaborative relationship with the community. Be mindful as well that when we talk about communities, we're not just talking about communities with formal governance structures, such as bands and band councils. This also applies to communities of interest. These are less formal communities who nevertheless are sort of brought together either by demographic characteristics or shared space or shared experiences. So the REB will require engagement, not just for working with specific communities, such as Sturgeon Lake First Nation, but where you're dealing with an Indigenous community of interest. Engagement should be at all times conducted with respect of the community context and the community's requirements. Where possible, there should be research agreements or memorandums of understanding with the community, both to protect the community, but also the researcher, and to really make sure that everyone's aware of what their role is in the research and what the research is trying to do. Basically, it ensures that there are no miscommunications or misunderstandings about what is intended with this research project. There should be a clear benefit to the community, not just, oh, well, we'll learn a little bit about them, but even material benefits to the community or training benefits to the community. A great way to approach this is for projects to involve community research partners who will be involved in the collection of the data and involved in the analysis of the data. The community or representatives of the community should be involved in the interpretation and analysis of the information. So when is engagement necessary? When the research is being conducted on Indigenous lands, When the research specifically targets participants of an Aboriginal identity, where there's a focus on cultural heritage, artifacts, or traditional knowledge, where Aboriginal identity is being used as a variable. So if your research is going to be, say, anonymous online questionnaire, but you're going to ask for demographic information from your participants so that you can say, well, 30% of our Aboriginal participants responded in such a way, you are now making cultural comments or conclusions about Aboriginal communities, Indigenous communities, and so engagement will be necessary with those communities or representatives of those communities. And finally, if the interpretation will refer to Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities, whether purposefully or even in such a way, or even, I don't want to say accidentally, but where the community you're looking at is predominantly Indigenous, and your conclusions are likely to basically be about an Indigenous community, even if that's not your intention, engagement is necessary. Right, so with my final 5 minutes, I just want to provide a few sort of important considerations, general observations from my time as a reviewer on ethics applications. So things to keep in mind when you are putting together your application. Ethics applications live or die on their language. Be simple, clear, and direct. Too many researchers, too many applicants harm their own application by using overly academic language, using just really complex, difficult to understand language. Keep in mind that your reviewer, in all likelihood, will not be an expert in your discipline. They will be an expert in the conduct of research with human participants, but they're in all likelihood not going to be an expert in your discipline. So write with that in mind. Avoid jargon, technical language. Try to keep it simple and clear. Always keep in mind your audience, both for your application itself and for your consent documents. Far too often, I've seen consent documents that are long, getting 5-7 pages long. Try to keep them short, clear, and to the point, and written in a language that your prospective participants are likely to understand. I see applications written for kids, consent documents written for kids, that it has taken me, half an hour to struggle through. So keep your audience in mind when you're writing your consent documents. Always be aware of policies at the University of Saskatchewan where that may affect either the conduct of your research or the recruitment of your participants, or even the storage of data. The University of Saskatchewan has certain policies that will affect the conduct of research involving human participants. These policies are not negotiable. The REB is very flexible about a lot of things in terms of how you are going to conduct your research. Policy requirements of the university are not negotiable, and the REB will try to accommodate you where it can, but it's not always going to be able to. So keep in mind, so for instance, data must be stored with the academic supervisor of a student project. That is not negotiable. And research data must be kept for 5 years post-publication. And again, that is not negotiable. And then finally, and this is, I touched upon this earlier, your reviewer is going to approach your ethics application as a dialogue. They're not looking to tell you what to do. They're looking to understand your project and then provide some feedback on the ethical aspects of it. So they're not going to say no, and they're not going to say, no, do this. They're going to say, well, there appears to be a gap in the information here, or maybe you could do this to, maybe consider doing this to better safeguard the confidentiality of your participants. When your project is reviewed, you will receive a notice of ethical review. It'll have a variety of requests for clarification, but also requests for changes. You don't have to make the changes that the REB is requesting. You can say, well, actually, we can't do this for this reason. So you have a voice in the process. Don't be afraid to use it, and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. That being said, always be mindful that the REB in some instances will say, actually, we're going to require that you do this. So they will dialogue, but where they have a strong opinion about something, they may actually overrule you. But in my experience, I would say 80 to 85% of the time, where the applicants push back against a request by the REB and providing context for and rationale for doing it, the REB says, actually, we didn't appreciate that, apologies, and will accept what the researcher is proposing. Finally, don't panic. Don't feel bad if your application comes back to you. Almost no applications are approved immediately. Even sort of well-experienced faculty members will receive lots of feedback on their ethics application. Give yourself enough time to receive approval. Fortunately, the REB, or the University of Saskatchewan, is seeing more and more behavioral research with human participants, which is great. But during that time, the administrative structure, that is the staff, myself and Joni, we have not increased. And so we have seen, every year we see about a 20 to 30% increase in our work volumes. And we remain a team of 2. So things are taking longer and longer, unfortunately. In particular, you want to leave yourself, I would say 8 to 10 weeks to get approval. And you want to avoid submitting an application in spring or early summer. Starting early March and going all the way till end of June, the REB gets absolutely bonkers. It is so busy, and in projects that are submitted in in spring and early summer will take 8 to 10 weeks just to be reviewed. So submit your application earlier rather than later. Don't let it wait. You want to give yourself 8, 10, maybe even 12 weeks to receive approval. There's nothing worse than trying to get an ethics application, a student project application through in 2 weeks. It's super stressful for the student, and it is just not a lot of fun. So try to give yourself as much time as possible. Be mindful of resources at the University of Saskatchewan that can help you draft your application, but also with the process itself. As I said before, your academic supervisor will be your primary and most important resource, but myself and my colleague Joni are here to help. So do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. We are here to help. And even if we don't, in the unlikely event that we don't have the information to answer your question, we'll know where to get it. And this is my most probably strangest piece of advice, in reviewing applications, when I come to review an application, I visualize the process. Too many ethics applications approach research with human participants as though we are disembodied brains floating through the ether. Research is a surprisingly physical activity. Pre-COVID, you would have to go somewhere, meet with people in a room, and that context really matters. And it still matters even in post-COVID, or not post-COVID, but sort of trans-COVID. So visualize what the data collection for your research project is going to look like. And then, because if you sort of describe it, what's in your head, that's going to help your REB reviewer understand what it is you're intending to do. Who's going to be in the room when the interview is occurring? Where is the interview or the focus group going to occur? What does that mean for the potential confidentiality of the participants? If someone sees me going to a focus group, through a door which has a big sign saying, a research project involving, such and such people, they now have a good sense of that I may be eligible for that project, and they may know something about that. Something about me, right? So that may be a breach of my privacy and confidentiality. So as I said before, we are here to help. You can contact us. Email is probably the best way to go about it, although you can always phone and leave a message. For behavioral applications, you can contact either myself or my colleague Joni Asham. We have two colleagues who work with the biomedical REB. The biomedical REB does things like surgical interventions and pharmacological clinical trials. So I suspect for this group, most likely wouldn't be involved. But if you do have questions about the biomedical applications and their processes, you can contact my colleagues, Caitlin Preble and Darcy Earle. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening, and we've got about 15 minutes for questions.
And just quickly, would you like me to stop the recording at this point, or you're okay with, okay?
Yeah, none of these are state secrets.
Okay.
You know, all of this should be shared as widely as possible.
Awesome, thanks. I see from the chat, there's a question about data storage. My supervisor is not located at the U of S, recently moved to the United States, but is adjunct. How would I deal with data storage in that case, especially with hard copies of consent forms, printed photographs, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And it's getting more and more frequent just because, you know, researchers are, you know, universities are getting more and more collaborative, which is great. But then that means that we have to be a little bit creative with data storage. So in this instance, the REB and the university have a couple of one of the reasons why the data needs to be maintained for 5 years post-publication is that there needs to be a record of what was said or of what the participants said that is readily available to the university and to the Research Ethics Board. And this is because if there is a complaint, or if there is an accusation of malfeasance or misrepresentation, then there needs to be a readily accessible record of that research data. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Sorry, there was feral children ransacking my fridge. Yeah, and so in this case, your data management plan will probably have to be a little bit different. It probably wouldn't be stored with your principal investigator. If you have a sub-investigator or sort of a secondary member of your academic committee who is here at the University of Saskatchewan, it's probably best to keep it with them. And that would be what the REB would want. Because if the researcher, if the principal investigator, that is your main academic supervisor, is at another institution, the REB and the university may have difficulty getting that information. So if you have a secondary member of your academic committee who's here at the university, who's a member of faculty, that's probably best. If not, you can always nominate someone who is not associated with the research to store the data. So in this instance, it is sort of what we're doing is we're peeling back the requirement to see what the principle underneath is. And this happens a lot in ethics applications where the REB has sort of a standard requirement, but once that requirement doesn't fit a specific project, we have to sort of peel back and understand what the principle underneath is so that we can find something that accommodates the specific context of the research project. So don't ever be afraid to suggest something. If you feel that there is a way to go about this, the REB is only too happy to consider that, but it may have its own preferred workaround. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, so in this case, yeah, I mean, nominating someone at the University of Saskatchewan, someone that is within the department or the college where you are working.
Awesome. I see a couple hands up, maybe Andrew and then James.
Thanks, Nick. Nice to see you. That
Nice to see you, Andrew.
Really helpful. Thank you.
Great.
There was a lot of great gems in there that I really appreciated. Like, oh, especially the context and rationality piece. I was like, ooh, that's really great. I was wondering, what's the best way to approach if a researcher has like an emergent research design, like realist evaluation or grounded theory? What's the best way for us to actually work and help like ethics with doing what they do, but also knowing that things might change kind of thing?
That's a great question. And yeah, the REB, those kinds of projects are always tough, right? Because the REB wants everything to be certain and specified, and it loves specificity and certainty. And a lot of, especially realist evaluations and sort of emergent design methodologies, they come to it and they say, well, this might happen, that might happen, and that's almost guaranteed to set your reviewer's hair on fire, right? Like they want certainty. What's the plan, right? So my recommendation is to try not to waffle too much in your application. Say this is our sort of our seed, right? This is our basic plan that we intend to do. But also be upfront to say, but we're also expecting to have emergent information. We expect as we go that we are going to change based on what we find, and that's fine. The REB will appreciate that, as long as you share what your plan is going to be. So usually where I see it's best done is where the applicant will say, this is our plan, but as things change, we will submit amendments, updating data collection tools, updating consent forms, and just to create that reassurance that you have a plan for how you're going to advise the REB about changes that will happen. So, and especially around data collection tools, pardon me, they don't have to be, if you are looking at things like Delphi projects and emergent design, sometimes the data collection tool, it's difficult to be like, here are specific questions. The REB will approve lists of topics, because with the data collection tool, what the REB is trying to really get its head around is, what are the risks to the participants and what kind of information are you asking? What kind of questions are you asking, right? So that they can get a sense of what the risk profile is of the project. So, and the topics help that just as well as the individual questions. So does that help?
Yeah, so it's kind of like when you talked about confidentiality and anonymity, like really being clear and like consistent in showing like, here's what the plan is, that
Exactly.
Showing that really helps the REB know kind of what's going on. And
yeah, and try not to be too like, a common mistake applications will make, especially where they have emergent design, is they'll talk about sort of potential means of data collection down the road, right? They'll be like, 90% of the application is we're doing focus groups, and it's like, we might also do interviews, I don't know. And then it's like, there's this little interview thing there, and that's going to stick right in your reviewer's craw. They're like, well, wait a minute, are you or are you not doing interviews? If there is a potential for them, it's not like you're going to be disadvantaged when you submit your amendment to be like, oh, we're doing interviews now. It's like, just the facts, just focus on what it is you're doing for this approval. If there's a potential to do other methods of data collection in the future, you don't have to sort of precede the REB with it. You can just address it in the amendment later on. Because what happens is it creates a dissonance in your reviewer's mind. It's like, well, wait a minute, are you or are you, like, they're not sure of what their responsibilities are in this review. Are they reviewing the interviews, or is this something for the future? So try to just to be very narrow in your focus, if that makes sense.
awesome, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I see James and then Rachel.
Thanks, Nick. I have Hamilton behind me still. I'm at the University of Regina and with Johnson Shoyama, and I've gone through a research ethics process here at the University of Regina, and Era Steinnicker is your counterpart here
Yep.
at the university, and she's been excellent. What I struggled with was the timing issues. Like, it took me 4 months to go through the process with minimal risk.
Yeah.
And I applied before Christmas, actually before mid-December, and I got notification in early April. So I had to almost ask where it was. It was like a black hole, and it was outside of the, we've received your request, and then it's been assigned a number. There was a period of time, it was significant, like about 6 to 8 weeks, where I didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
And I had to go and ask, and that seemed to be challenging. I was thinking, there's certain things that these things have been around for 50 years. There's institutional memory here in terms of process.
Yeah.
And you referred it to yourself, I think, just the lack of increasing resources, particularly as the number of applications for behavioral research has increasing. So if the university is really about supporting researchers and students to attract them to come and do research, we have to find better ways to balance out some resources. And I want to talk a little bit about what is the average waiting time. I think that for me as a Métis researcher, even though that, and I've only had experience through the U of S through someone else who I co-lead a SHRC project with, it's taken 4 months to get an exemption, for example.
Yeah.
So I find that when there is Indigenous research, it elevates the bar and it takes longer for the process. And if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, James. So I'll just touch on a variety of, and I may not be able to, just remind me at the end if I missed anything. But so, I mean, our processes are too long. It is a brutal wait for the researchers right now. And, we are, as a team of two, we are totally overwhelmed, especially when, the poop hits the fan in February, And we were supposed to have, so in May of 2018, the university gave us a soft rollout for an automated online system that was supposed to manage University of Saskatchewan research ethics applications. And that soft rollout is still going on today. So applications that are submitted to U of S are submitted via emails. I'm sure many of these people will know. And then the university is paying people to input that into Universe on behalf of researchers, because researchers don't have access to the module. And this is where we've been for 3 years. We've been screaming for additional help. We've been screaming for a better online system, which would make things, which would automate notifications, which would make everything so much easier. So, and it's just not coming. Part of it is the University of Saskatchewan is under brutal resource constraints right now. And we are one voice among many, and we make the arguments that you've made, but at this point the university is either unable or unwilling to provide extra resources. So we're hopeful that we will have a new fully functioning online system beginning of next year, but we've been sitting on Universe now for 3 years, so a little bit of cynicism is creeping into me. But I would say, and this is really important, I would say if you haven't heard from a while, don't be afraid to reach out. As I said, we are pretty overwhelmed, so our ability to provide those reassurances, thank you, we received your thing, this is where it's going, we just can't do that. But it's really helpful for us. Because our processes are so manual, we're only human and we're dealing with an overwhelming amount of information. We miss applications. Applications get submitted, they don't go to the right place, and suddenly they don't exist for us, right? And the researchers left waiting for months and months. We do what we can, but the manual nature of our processes mean that risk is ever present. So we're trying to do what we can, but these are decisions that occur well above us. Our office is being restructured again. This is the third restructure I've experienced in my time at University of Saskatchewan. So there's a lot of unsettled here, and we do what we can, and we don't take affront when you ask, hey, wait a minute, can I get an update? Because that then we can then be like, oh yeah, it's here. And like you said, you wait for 8 weeks because it's just sitting there. Takes us 8 weeks during the spring and summer just to get to the application. In terms of Indigenous engaged research, it does have an extra layer because this, I don't want to speak for U of R, but U of S, this REB takes it really seriously and it wants to do a good job. And that means that there's an extra layer of scrutiny. I don't want to say scrutiny, but there's usually extra considerations that can complicate these things. So, and especially during COVID, that has really complicated Indigenous engaged research. And so it's, you know, most times it's all right, especially where the engagement piece is really well done. But you know, in many ways, in my experience, the delays are usually not around engagement. It's usually around something else. Engagement, in my mind, is sort of, it's like an inverted bell curve. Most applications that have done it really, really well, and the REB actually has very little to say about it. Most of the strife that researchers experience around engagement is because they haven't done it, and the REB feels that some engagement is necessary. And these are typically researchers who are working with communities of interest that are likely to have a high proportion of Indigenous participants. And so suddenly the REB is like, well, wait a minute, you need to do something. And they're like, well, what do I do? And they're like, you identify your community, you speak to your community and see what they want to do, right? So I wouldn't say that, you know, that typically Indigenous engaged research will be delayed, but it does happen. But it's not usually because of the engagement, it may be because of something else. And sometimes projects just get delayed because we get overwhelmed and we just can't get to them. So does that help? Do you have a follow-up or?
Well, I think one of the follow-up for me was the ethics office, the research office not being that versed in photo voice methodologies and methods. And so I think it was a novel research method of collecting and interpreting data. And they had to put their minds around it. So there was a bit of a learning curve, I think, for people in the office. And eventually, I think we had a really great conversation. And I think we've raised the bar, and it's going to really benefit people after me.
Yeah, photo voice is always really complicated. What I would say is, you know, going back to my sort of note about how this is a dialogue is, you know, it never hurts to suggest to have a meeting, right? You know, it's communicating via email it's ponderous, context is missed, and there's not that flow of ideas. Whereas, you know, I've never seen researchers leave a meeting with the REB mad, right? Everyone's always arrived at a very good place as a result of the meeting. And you have the authority to ask for that, right? You don't have to just accept, well, you know, just this unhelpful back and forth. If you feel a meeting is necessary, don't be afraid to request one.
Are there any other questions? I know we're at 1 o'clock now, but if you have a few minutes, Nick, and just in case there are other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I saw a hand go up and come down. So if that was because of time, feel free to ask.
Yeah, that was me. I actually pulled my, hi Nick, nice to see you. I pulled my hand down because James asked exactly the question I was going to ask. And so thank you for the response to that. And just because it does bear mentioning that the delays are rough. I mean, you know that, Nick, and so thank you for that. But I wonder if there's any way for us as researchers to even put pressure, because what has happened in some instances, and I'm sure other people have experienced this, is like, it's particularly with community agencies. Community organizations don't operate according to the same timelines as the university, right? And so summer is a very busy period. And so to say, you know, this period, there's no response, it doesn't work to community organizations that are dependent upon funding deadlines. Their grants are running out in short order. So, I mean, Nick, I know you're nodding, you know this, we've discussed this, but that's the piece that really I think is important, or if we can kind of get that through, that I have been witness to community organizations not wanting to engage in community in research of this sort because it really delays their projects. So yes, if there's any way that we can write letters and petitions, I'm all for it.
If you've got $8 million kicking around, right? So it never hurts. The University of Saskatchewan research community is a great community in my experience. Everyone's been very supportive and everyone's happy to put pressure where they can. And so it never hurts to talk to your, within your colleges and departments, to the powers that be, deans, associate deans, research in particular, just to, vent your frustrations at them, and make sure that they are communicating to, in this case, the OVPR and the VPR, that it's as resourced, ethics is taking too long. And we're doing what we can to make things faster, and some things have worked and some things they haven't been actively harmful, but they weren't as helpful as we envisaged. But we're kind of like, we can't do less, right? We are doing as little as we can to get in the way, without, to prevent unnecessary delays, but it's just the volume. It's just brutal now. And the problem is that our offices had to push the work onto the vice chairs of the REB, and they're starting to burn out. And so we're actually getting into a very fragile area where, the REB is starting to itself is starting to struggle, because Joni and I we just can't do the work. And so the good news is we're getting a 4-month coordinator. They found funding for a 4-month coordinator, and that will help a lot. And we can take back a bit of the work that we put onto the vice chair. So, and hopefully that should improve things. And, and we're hopeful that we might be able to, just through institutional inertia, that 4-month will sort of bleed into a permanent position, which would be immensely helpful. But, talk to, where you see that, especially with concrete examples, talk to your associate dean research, tell them that it is not in the university's best interest, especially around a signature area like, Indigenous engaged research, for this to be going this way, right? If the University of Saskatchewan envisages itself as a world-class U15 university, and that's like, but I would argue certainly that its investment in human ethics research doesn't reflect that. So, and there are, university, your colleagues across the university are doing that. They're putting pressure on their ADRs to say, look, we can't do what we need to, and our students can't do it. So, and I guess it just needs to be, more voices always help, right? So. I am actually, yeah. As the father of 2 small children, I could use even more pairs of hands around. So, I mean, the team is, Joni and our front office are great, and if I could clone them, I could conquer the world. But we're hopeful with this 4-month position that it'll be a real benefit. So we've got someone lined up at the beginning, and they're going to be great. So I'm optimistic about the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think maybe we'll wrap it up now. So I'm just going to hit stop